Visiting Another Life Through Hypnosis, an article from the July 1954 issue of Fate magazine, by Vaughan Shelton, read by Felix Warren. The men in wrinkled green fatigue uniforms wouldn't have been more bewildered if Marilyn Monroe or her 1944 counterpart had appeared among them, calendar-clad, stepping out of a puff of smoke. She would have been less a departure from the average soldier's train of thought. They should have been prepared for anything. 3 weeks earlier, under the guidance of the same hypnotist, another young soldier had made the long mental journey to his home in Reading, Pennsylvania, had described the Sunday afternoon scene he found there, his sister making candy, the family dog in a frenzy of excitement at his appearance, etc. A subsequent exchange of V-mail had verified all the details he gave. Now, Paul Collins, fast asleep on an army cot while the siege guns thumped and tumbled over at Metz, was the cause of the men's amazement. His head rolled from side to side as though he were having a troubled dream, but his voice was flat and expressionless. "My name is Lawrence Vance." Then, a few moments later, in the same hypnotic monotone, "I died in 1794. It developed that Paul remembered, or seemed to remember, a great deal about Lawrence Vance, dead these 150 years. In fact, he may have remembered more than he was willing to tell. The autobiography of Lawrence Vance, that Paul recited from his hypnotic sleep, may seem less bizarre if you know the events that led up to it. Paul had grown up in Connecticut to the age of 21, anyway. In April 1943, he left college in his second year to enter the Army. His company arrived in England in September 1943, the month in which a national magazine published an article about the late Edgar Cayce, celebrated clairvoyant of Virginia Beach. Sometime in October, Paul got a hold of a copy of the magazine and read the article. He was surprised to discover that Cayce, talking in hypnotic trance, had been counseling people all over the world for more than 30 years, giving sound and sometimes profound advice on matters of health, marriage, vocation, personality development, etc. As he read all this, the young soldier remembered there was a man in his outfit who pronounced his name Cayce and spelled it C-A-Y-C-E. This turned out to be Hugh Lynn, one of Edgar's sons. He knew about the article. He was proud of his gifted father, but braced for a merciless ribbing when his buddies learned of the relationship. Paul buttonholed him in the chow line that evening and waved the magazine in his face. "Say," he began, "you're from Virginia Beach, aren't you?" "Go ahead," said Hugh Lynn. "Ask me if Edgar Cayce is a fake." "Okay, is he?" "No." "Good. I'm glad to hear it. Now, about these readings." Paul was curious, not skeptical. He asked a lot of questions, got a lot of answers, and became convinced that Edgar Cayce could help him decide what to do after the war. He wrote a letter to Mr. Cayce asking his advice, giving only his name and birth date as required. Presently, a 4-page manuscript arrived from Virginia Beach. It was a typed transcript of his reading, given by Edgar Cayce while fast asleep, 4,000 miles away. This was a puzzling document. It began by explaining the novel theory, novel to Paul, that is, that one's personality is the result of everything he has experienced and thought about, not only during his present life, but in other lives preceding this one. It even gave him brief sketches of 3 or 4 of his alleged sojourns in the past. The analysis of Paul's character was searching, and he admitted, very accurate. The suggestions as to his vocation made a lot of sense. But the other lives were hard to take. Hugh Lynn found him sitting on his bunk with the reading in his hand, a glazed look in his eye. "What do you think about it?" he asked. Paul wasn't sure. "This business about other lives makes me feel like a ghost." "You'll get used to it," Hugh Lynn told him. "Either that or you'll forget it. They all do." Paul showed the reading only to one other buddy before tucking it away in his barracks bag. On the seesaw between the boredom and frantic activity of army life, it was forgotten, or seemed to be. Next year, the Normandy invasion came off, and November 1944 found Paul and his company billeted in an old chateau during the stalemate at Metz in eastern France. The days were a dreary brew of mud, monotony, and guard duty, and nothing to write home about. About this time, Bill Weldon of McAllister, Oklahoma, who had been a professional magician and hypnotist in civilian life, began holding demonstrations for his bored companions. Bill was clever. He had a large assortment of stage and parlor tricks and, of course, no lack of subjects willing to be hypnotized. Bill liked to experiment with memory. The subject would be placed in deep hypnosis and then told to remember some event of early childhood, such as his 4th birthday or some other occasion that time had erased from the conscious mind. Tears rolled down the cheeks of one soldier as he recounted a long-forgotten surprise party with a cake that big. Weldon's stunt of making a person forget was interesting, too. He'd give the post-suggestion to a sleeping boy that he'd forget his name when he woke up and not remember it until the hypnotist snapped his fingers. It always worked. Paul had never been hypnotized, but he turned out to be a good subject. He watched the tip of Weldon's finger and listened to the pleasant, droning voice and drifted into slumber. After the usual test to see if he were asleep or feigning, Bill proceeded with the memory routine. Then he told Paul to forget his name and gave him the suggestion to wake up. The young man opened his eyes and looked around the room, confused. "What's your name, buddy?" Weldon asked. Paul blinked and chewed his lip. "Funny, I don't remember." Then the hypnotist recalled he hadn't given the boy a signal at which his memory would return. "Let's sleep a little longer and bring your name back to you." "According to theory," Weldon commented when Paul had dropped off again, "the second sleep is much deeper than the first. He's way under now. He'd remember his name in the morning anyway, but I don't like to leave any loose ends. All right, now, tell me your full name, Paul." "My name is Lawrence Vance." Only 2 people in the room had heard the name before, Hugh Lynn Cayce and the other friend who'd seen Paul's reading. Cayce leaned forward and whispered to Weldon, "Are you sure he's asleep?" "Absolutely. He must be dreaming about something." Weldon was interested in development. Paul's reading had told him he had lived in the New World in the time of the early settlings under the name of Lawrence Vance and made a career out of organizing young people's groups. No other specific details that might have helped Paul fill out an imaginary history of Lawrence Vance were given. "Ask him when he was born," hissed Lynn. Weldon repeated the question, and the boy stirred again and answered, "In 1754. "And when did you die?" "In 1794. Lest this whole matter seemed too absurd for grown men to take seriously, it should be remembered that Weldon was an experienced professional hypnotist who was sure that Paul was asleep. And Hugh Lynn Cayce, after having convinced himself while in college that his father's clairvoyance wasn't a fake, had made a career of investigating psychic phenomena in many parts of the United States. He had conducted a series of radio programs on the subject and was something of an authority on psychic frauds. "Ask him where he was born," he whispered. Gradually, by questions and answers, the life history of Lawrence Vance took shape. It made my spine tingle, not because it was dramatic, but because of its very simplicity. It was just the recollections of a commonplace early American with commonplace problems. Or so it seemed. Vance was born in southwestern Pennsylvania, no great distance from Fort Pitt, the present site of Pittsburgh. He was the only son of a pioneer family. His father had a little education and, since there were no schools, taught his son to read and write during the long, silent evenings in the wilderness cabin. This smattering of learning made Lawrence dissatisfied with the frontier farmer's hard life. While still in his teens, he began to travel among the widely scattered settlements, teaching and organizing young people's groups similar to the present 4-H clubs. Lawrence didn't recall being involved in any trouble with the Indians. He saw quite a few of them in his journeys, he said, and they were very friendly. Sometimes he helped them in their bartering with the traders from the east. Although he traveled on foot, Vance covered a wide area in his organizing work, going down into Virginia and later into parts of what is now Ohio. "The help I tried to give was appreciated," he said. Once, while tramping north on his way home from a Virginia settlement, he met a party of hunters riding horses. They were gentlemen hunting for sport. One of them recognized Lawrence and introduced him to the others. One very tall, straight gentleman said he had heard of Vance's work and congratulated him. He asked Lawrence to have supper at the inn in the next village that evening and tell him more about it. It was quite a distance to the village on foot, farther than the gentleman had realized when he gave the invitation. When Lawrence arrived at the inn, much later than the appointed time, he found that Mr. Washington had already left, leaving a message of regret. So far, Lawrence Vance had related nothing about himself that an average fertile imagination couldn't dream up. Now he spoke of his more personal affairs, and the picture got complicated. During his 19th year, the organizer visited his parents' home. There were many changes from the old days. Other families had settled there, and it was now a flourishing farming community. And there was Constance Moore. The reedy little girl he had played with as a child had become a comely, dark-haired young woman. Partly at the urging of his father, who wanted him to settle down to farming, and partly from his own awakened interest, though one had the impression that a matter of honor was concerned, he asked Constance to be his wife. She accepted, and the wedding date was set. Weldon slipped in the question, "Is Constance alive now?" Without hesitating, Paul answered, "Yes." "Do you know her?" "Yes." "What is her name now?" "I would rather not talk about this." But before the nuptials could take place, the fickle Lawrence met a girl named Anne at a nearby settlement and married her instead. Commenting on this perfidy, he said, "I often regretted it. I regret it still." He brought his wife home and started to work clearing some land and building a cabin. It was hard work with small returns, and he soon came to hate it. In addition, Constance hadn't taken the jilting well. She immediately married a much older man and was desperately unhappy. She often came to Lawrence's cabin and created embarrassing scenes in front of his wife, begging him to leave Anne and run away with her. Finally, the elder Vance suggested that Lawrence move to a new locality and loaned him some money. The move was made, but for some reason, Paul would not say where the new locality was. Beyond this point, the story of Lawrence Vance bogged down. His answers became evasive, or he refused to answer at all. He did say, however, that he had 2 children, a boy named Lawrence and a girl named Suzanne. The boy drowned in a river at the age of 11. The girl grew up and married. At some unspecified point, Vance went back to his organizing work on the frontier. The settlements were moving westward, and his activities took him farther afield than before. In the winter of 1794, in spite of the pleadings of his wife and the fact that he had a very bad cold, he set out for the territory beyond the Ohio River. The many days' journey to the river is our only clue to the point from which he started. He was traveling with a group of other people. His cold fever grew worse daily, and he realized it had been a fatal mistake to leave home. During this description of the last hours of Lawrence Vance, Paul showed emotion for the first and only time. His face became a picture of anguish as he told how Vance reached the limit of his endurance in the deep woods beyond the Ohio. Sick unto death and among strangers, far from home, he passed from life and was buried on the spot where he took his last breath. They didn't even mark the grave. The obvious gap in Paul's story was the important period of the Revolution during which Vance would have been in his middle 20s. To all questions on this period, he gave devious answers or none at all. Weldon tried various approaches but got little information. "Were you in favor of the colonial cause?" "Yes," very emphatically. "Did you take part in the rebellion?" "Yes, but I did not bear arms." "What part did you take?" "I did not bear arms." "Were you a Quaker?" "No, though I admired them and knew many." "What was your religion?" At Hugh Lynn's suggestion, Weldon was looking for a church affiliation through which marriage and birth records, if any, could be traced. It drew a blank. "I had my own ideas about religion," said Paul. The refusal to talk about the Revolution was curious. If this were a tall tale, it would provide a chance to bring in some heroics, though Paul had shown no desire to dramatize Vance. On the other hand, it would not be wise to connect him with historic events that could easily be verified. Just before waking the boy up, Weldon shoved a writing pad into his left hand and a pencil into his right. "Write your name for me, Paul," he ordered. The eyes were still closed. The right hand fumbled with the pencil as if in doubt how to hold it, finally placing it between the index and second fingers as one would hold a quill pen. With a flourish, the name Lawrence Vance was traced on the paper. The signature was large, with the tail of the last letter swept around to underline both words. Paul's natural handwriting is small and precise. Weldon gave his usual instructions about feeling rested and refreshed, and then wakened him. Paul listened to the story he had told in his sleep with much skepticism. He had no recollection of it, he said, and the whole affair seemed to hang on the question of who was ribbing whom. The most convenient explanation of the Vance affair was that Paul had put on a very clever act, very clever indeed, to almost convince a professional hypnotist and an experienced psychic investigator to say nothing of assorted spectators of average intelligence. There are other possibilities. The subconscious mind, we are told, is quite capable of inventing such a fantasy if it has the proper suggestion to get it started. And Paul's reading had supplied a very pointed suggestion. Telepathy is also a possibility. The story told by Paul could have originated in the imagination of someone else present. But there was no way of proving any of the alternatives. Perhaps, after the war, someone would take a look in the Pennsylvania State Archives, just out of curiosity. After the war, just out of curiosity, someone did. Between 1754 and 1794, several Vances appear in the official state records, but there is only one Lawrence Vance to be found. The archives afford us just a brief glimpse of him. On June 30th, 1779, in execution of a sentence of treason, the estates of a Mr. Reynold Keene in Meomensing Township, Philadelphia County, were confiscated by the county agent. In listing the various properties belonging to the estates, the agent appended a note that one farmhouse and tract of land had been leased on the previous March 17th to Lawrence Vance. Did Lawrence move this far to get away from Constance Moore? Tax records show the gentleman paid taxes on the property during the rest of 1779 and the first half of 1780. Early in 1780, Lawrence's number came up in the draft. A militia roster, prepared in the spring of that year, includes his name. He was called for duty but excused at appeal. Later in the same year, the Vance property was again seized. For an explanation, we turn away to the militia records and discover that the army had caught up with Mr. Vance. But why was his property seized? The August 10th, 1780 muster roll of Captain John Flynn's company, 2nd Regiment of Foot, Philadelphia County, lists Lawrence Vance as a private. After his name is the curt entry, deserted. So at last we find something about the Vance case that cannot be questioned. If Paul's Lawrence Vance and the only Lawrence Vance in the archives are the same person, he had good reason not to discuss his part in the Revolutionary War. If you enjoyed this reading of this article, please subscribe, please hit the like button, and feel free to comment with any suggestions and any questions, and especially anything that you would like me to read. Thank you, and have a lovely day.